Let's thank you for the way that you enable all of us to gather in this moment and to gather throughout the week for learning and elevation. Today is a great treat for me. One of my most influential teachers, a man who gave me a new set of lenses with which to read text, is our guest, Dr. Peter Pitzele, and a beloved friend. My goal will be to give a little bit of a context through some questions so you get to meet Peter. And that's also and largely focused on an introduction to us doing a little bibliodrama together. So I begin with you, my friend, Peter. Tell us about your love of stories and when did that begin for you?
Well, once upon a time, there was a boy who had a father whose name actually was Merlin, Merlyn. And it turned out that this little boy grew up with a father who was a storyteller. And the most magical moments of this young boy's life was listening to his father either read a story, and his father had a beautiful baritone voice. He was not a performer, but he loved words, or tell a story improvisationally. And he would just, you couldn't tell the difference between something that was true and something that was not true when my father was telling a story. And I have often been accused by my wife and my children of saying something that sounds so plausible when I'm just making it up. So that's how to, being a storyteller is actually a dubious profession because, people want to hear stories, but they want the facts. And I was always drawn to a place where facts weren't the issue, where imagination was the issue. But my journey to storying in that way took me through the paths of English literature. And I climbed a very high staircase. Well, we'll talk about him. He climbed a very high staircase, our young hero. And when he reached the top and he looked around, he realized that this was not meant for him. This way of doing stories was not meant for him. It was too, well, you could say it was too academic, but it was also too literal. It was too disembodied. There was no real imagination in it. It was all analysis. And this was, he could do it, obviously, but he didn't really love it. It wasn't in his heart. And so he fell off the ladder and he fell. And in every story, there's a falling. The hero has to fall. And he fell and fell, and he fell back into his father's house. And he was ashamed to be back in his father's house. But his father said, listen, why don't you study a new study called psychodrama? Oh, that sounded a little scary to our hero. But he had no options. And so there in his father's house, which was a big house of many rooms, and it had a theater in it, and it had a woman in that theater who was a magician, who was the storyteller of psychodrama. Wow, did you hear that sound? That's the sound of the curtain going up in the theater of psychodrama. And there is our hero, stumbling and stuttering and stammering his way through a whole new storytelling vocabulary. And when he comes out the other side, he can tell stories with living people, their stories. He helps people to tell their own stories in a theatrical way. Then our hero gets his first job as a psychodrama storyteller in a psychiatric hospital run by a man named Sam. Not Uncle Sam. No, he wasn't any Uncle Sam. He was more like fatherly Sam, but a Jewish father. Our hero's father was Jewish, but very, very secular, very assimilated. Father Sam was a Jewish father, and he worked at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Now, I have to tell you that our hero had no Jewish, no bar mitzvah, no Seder, no aunts and uncles to tell him stories, no Bible learning. He was a very, very straight, Western assimilated man. But he fell under the spell of this Father Sam, who was outwardly Jewish and openly Jewish. And it actually, our hero was born in 1941 after all. So even though he grew up far, far away from Europe and the Holocaust and all these terrors, he knew about that. He knew it when he was a little boy. He knew it. It entered his dreams, actually, the Holocaust. So when he met Father Sam, who was so outwardly Jewish and using the Jewish this and the Jewish that, he was a little afraid, like, Sam, you're going to get in trouble. Don't you realize that the world's not safe for Jews? But Sam seemed oblivious. He seemed beyond it. He was so secure, so merry, so jolly, so kind, that they formed a friendship. And Father Sam began a study group at the hospital, reading the book of Genesis. And there was our hero in this group, reading the book of Genesis. Now, he brought to it all of this literature stuff he knew. He was good at reading. But that Jewish stuff, that was totally new. The stories, the notion that these stories had been told for thousands of years, amazing. Anyways, Father Sam, to come to the end of the story, Father Sam is teaching at the Jewish Theological Seminary a course on leadership. And one day he says to our hero, I've got to be out of town. Would you teach a class for me at the Jewish Theological Seminary to fifth-year rabbinical students? Well, our hero couldn't say no to the rabbi, to Father Sam. I mean, after all, this is my boss, his boss, but also an exemplary man. So our hero says yes, and he goes into this classroom full of like trepidation, like he's never been in the presence of rabbis, to say nothing of fifth-year rabbinical students at the Jewish Theological Seminary of New York, students of the great Father Sam. And maybe some of you have been substitute teachers. You know, substitute teaching is very difficult. So what does our hero do? All he really knows how to do at this point is read a story. He got that from his literature, and do a role play. So he goes into this class and he says, he's so insecure, it's ridiculous. But he says, look, I've only got one thing I can offer you. Take it or leave it, so to speak. I know that Moses was a great leader. By the way, our hero did really not know anything about the story of Moses at that point, but he knew enough to know that Moses was a great leader. And he knew that these guys were, all men, by the way, were going to rabbi. They knew about Moses. So our hero says to these men, look, Moses must have had many, many crises in his life, crises of leadership. Choose one of these crises and tell me about it, but tell me about it in the voice of Moses. Is it clear? Clear? There were kind of minor nods. And I waited. The longest period of waiting, unendurable waiting that I can ever remember. I wanted the floor to swallow me up because I was sure that somebody from the class was going to say to me, well, and I thought he would be like the designated hitter, excuse me, that's not the kind of thing we do here at the Jewish Theological Seminary of New York as fifth-year rabbinical students preparing for our first pulpits. So somebody raises his hand, and expecting the worst, I call on this person. And he said, well, I don't know where we're going. And I say, you're Moses. He said, yeah, well, I'm Moses. I don't know where we're going. You know, I mean, the Lord told me to lead these people, but I have no map. Years have gone by. They are losing confidence in me and the whole enterprise. I mean, I'm actually beginning to doubt whether I should have ever undertaken this in the first place. Thank you very much. Another hand goes up. Moses, yes, I'm Moses, and I, you know, these people are always fighting with one another. They're arguing all the time. Factions and tribes and vendettas. I'm not a mediator. I don't know how to make peace with people. It's beyond me. I need help. Thank you. Another hand goes up. I'm supposed to teach these people law. You know, I got the law. They've been slaves. They've had enough law. They don't want any law. They wanted their freedom. How do I teach the law to these people that are so, well, frankly, ignorant, but also they're not very interested in the law? Well, so it goes. I mean, everybody, I mean, that time fills up and the class is over. And our hero is like so relieved, standing in a puddle of his own sweat. But something has happened to him that is resonating with it. And the man from the class remains behind. He says to our hero, you know, that was really interesting. What you were doing was a kind of midrash. Well, our hero knows nothing about midrash. This is a new word. And he says, spell it right at the M-I-D-R-A-S-H. And our hero goes home and he goes on Google and he looks it up and he thinks, really? I didn't know I could tell a story and have people imagine parts of the story that were in there but not explicit. Midrash is about what we called in our literature class the subtext, what's left out. But when he studied literature, they weren't interested in what was left out. They only wanted to know about how you could analyze what was put in. But here's this thing called midrash where they're interested in what's left out, which means they're interested in the imagination. And there began for me my Jewish journey. And well, 25 years later, I was bar mitzvahed. Next question. Aren't you sorry you asked?
I love the story of the hero. And again, for those listening, it's Joseph Campbell's hero. Joseph Campbell, the great father, teacher of mythology, referred to each of us as a hero, having a life of challenges and the opportunity to grow. So because our time is limited, I'm looking at my clock, 10 more minutes.
Oh my God.
And then a little bibliodrama. But I want to take all of us forward to you entering a room in Europe. where you're greeted as the father of bibliodrama. Set the scene.
Oh, I will.
And take it forward to that. What you just shared was the first time at the Jewish Theological Seminary you ever engaged in the Midrash of Torah. Take it to this next, to where it will unfold.
So now, fast forward, our hero. I'm going to keep it in the Joseph Campbellian mode of the hero's journey. Our hero gets a call from Germany, where apparently our hero has named his methodology Bibliodrama. Once upon a time, he called it the psychodrama of the Bible. That scared the pants off of everybody. He called it Bibliodrama. Well, that was still fairly intimidating, but nonetheless, there were people for whom that was an appealing process. And our hero developed a reputation and even an income stream to supplement his work at the hospital. And our hero gets a call from Germany saying that they have heard of Bibliodrama American style, and they would like, they have a European society of they call Bibliodrama, which apparently is quite different from the Jewish Midrashic Pitzele version. Would you come over to our annual conference and present as your keynote speaker? And I, who was this boy who knew about the Holocaust somehow, very deeply inwardly, but never practically actually, goes to Germany for the first time with all of the fears, the prejudices, the concerns that someone who was born in 1941 might have. And I conducted a bibliodrama for this group. And there were about roughly 100 people who belonged to this society from all over Europe, Christians, every one of them. And there were two people in that group who followed me afterwards to say, we want to learn how to do this. And so my wife, Susan, and I were invited back to Europe many times. And a network was set up of trainers, teachers. We taught people how to teach it. And to date, there are more than 15,000 people worldwide who have been trained in bibliodrama out of this network that is developed, which is now an international network that emanates in Germany, but my book has been translated into Korean. We have programming in South Africa. Now, these are churches, but nonetheless, the core of it, and this is what's really important. I have insisted, and they have retained the notion of this work as midrash, that it emanates from the Jewish tradition as a way to read story, so that people actually do say, after a bibliodrama, I'm never going to read the Bible the same way again. And that work has brought me into the friendship of many people, but perhaps the dearest friend I ever made, I made with Elie Spitz, who was there at the Jewish Theological Seminary when our hero was simply the naive, green behind the ears, wet behind the nose fellow, stammering and stuttering his way into a new world. And I was brought to that class, and I was asked to teach about the rabbi as counselor. And in that class, I said to the members of the class, and we're about to do this with you right now, so this is a warm-up for the demonstration of bibliodrama. I said to that class, choose a biblical character who needs therapy. Well, where to start? Hand goes up. This young, bushy-haired young man says, I have one. And I come up and I put this young man in a chair, and I say, well, who are you? He says, I'm Sarah. And what did you say, Elie? Go ahead. Take it from there. You're Sarah.
Well, I remember distinctly the moment.
You are Sarah. Be Sarah.
In this moment, though
Yeah,
I will
Sarah.
add, just for context, I was not the bushy young man who came forward in that moment. It was a classmate of mine. I know who it is. I can still see the moment.
Okay.
And I was the first class of women at JTS, the class that would finish in 1988. And what was even more dramatic about this moment is this classmate raises his hand. He comes forward and he, a man, says, "I am Sarah." And I remember, because I was once surprised. I had started rabbinical school with this man 5 years before in Los Angeles. I knew him well. So I'm first surprised that he volunteered. Second, I'm surprised that he is chosen instead of all the men in the Bible to be a woman. And he says as follows to you. And one other piece, you had said to us, you said, "I'm a little intimidated. I'm your substitute teacher teaching a group of rabbis. So I'm going to stretch myself and imagine myself as a rabbi, a huge stretch. And now I'd like one of you to demonstrate with a huge stretch of being a biblical character." And there my friend Keith sits down and he says, "I'm Sarah. My husband has tried to kill our son. He says God told him to do it. I am outraged by him, by his God. I can't look at him. I want to leave him. Rabbi, counsel me. I want to leave my husband." And in that moment of feeling Sarah's outrage and pain, the Bible opened up in a new way.
Good. Thank you. Wonderful. It's still, it's very chilling because what happens in a bibliodrama is that you're in not just the first person singular, where the person, the congregant, the rabbi, the child in a classroom, the teacher in a training program, puts their I into the biblical character. I am Sarah, not I was Sarah or she was so outraged. I am outraged. I feel betrayed by what my husband has done. He didn't even tell me. He snuck off with our kid. My child, I waited all my life to have a baby. All of this. Not only is it first person singular, it's in the present tense. I am Sarah now. I am feeling this now. And that is where the particular power of bibliodrama lies. And I do want to, at the risk of losing our time to role play, and you've heard from our host, Ari, that this is by no means a unique opportunity for you to have this experience with me. But believe me, you can have this experience with Rabbi Spitz, or this is not a rare thing anymore. I do want to say something about what happens to the player who plays the part. Now, Elie gives us an example of the man, Keith, who plays the woman, Sarah, in a condition and situation that is unimaginable for any man to have had. No man has had a baby whose husband's gone off and tried to sacrifice him to God. No, very few women have, presumably. Although in this modern age, things have changed. Nonetheless, I'm not talking politics here. I'm just thinking how crazy the world is. But when Keith stepped out of that role and went back to his seat, I said to Keith, in later times, I would say to Keith, so Keith, right now you came up and spontaneously delivered the Sarah in this terrible post-Akedah moment. What you spoke of, the feelings you have, Keith, can you find those feelings anywhere in your own history? Now, obviously not this sacrificial drama, But every time I have invited a player to look at where that might have come from in his or her own story, they have always recognized that there was a mirror in the role play. So the book that I wrote about Bibliodrama is called Scripture Windows, which focuses on the insights that we get into Torah from doing Bibliodrama. But the book I didn't write is called Scripture Mirror, which is where we see our own stories told in the Bible when we step into it and allow ourselves to take on the condition of the biblical characters.
And I'll just add another book that you wrote, Our Father's Wells, describes a number of the bibliodramas that you facilitated and to some degree unpack for you some of the takeaways.
Exactly.
And another very rich reading. And I will add for all of those who are sharing this moment with you, Peter, that one of Peter's gifts is he's a great writer and a poet. And his books are remarkable, as beautifully, engagingly written. But for you, Peter, I know as that you are first and foremost a storyteller. That it is your way to be in the moment, unmediated. And with that, this is straight up the half-hour mark, which means we have 10 or 15 minutes to do a little bibliodrama, which we had talked about before we began this morning. And why don't you set it up? And we'll do it for like 10 or 12 minutes, and then people will have an opportunity to react to both the bibliodrama and also to your own journey of the hero.
Right. So what I propose to do with you, Elie, is what I've called the biblical interview. And that is where either you offer a character you would like to have interviewed, like you could be X and coming to me like in the therapeutic class, or I can propose a character for you and for you to respond to. And you and I had a preamble, and we know how we're going to do this, but we haven't rehearsed it. There's never a rehearsal with bibliodrama. So I'm going to go back to the primary role, the first role I ever asked anyone to play. Elie, I want you to beam yourself down into the sandals of Moses at a particular moment. And that moment is, and I'll give you the context for it, you've just been part of the war on the Amalekites. You have been sitting on the top of a hill with a rod of staff, the staff of God in your hand. When you raised the staff, the Israelites prevailed. Joshua's out there. And when you lowered the staff, the Israelites were killed, they'd be dying. So you knew you had to keep the staff up, and you got increasingly weary. And you had two people up there, one on either side of you, Aaron and a man named Hur, and you had them hold up your arms, and they gave you a stone to sit on, and you sat there all day long with your arms in the air. End of chapter 17 in Book of Exodus. Chapter 18 opens, Moses, a knock on your door of your tent. It's one of the sentries who guards the perimeter of the camp coming to tell you that there's somebody out there who says his name is Jethro. He's got a woman with him named Zipporah. Did I get that right? And there are two kids, F something and I don't remember the names. He says it's your family, Moses. They've come here to see you. Moses, what is that moment like for you when you hear that your father-in-law, the Midianite priest, and your wife Zipporah, whose name means song, bird, songbird, and your 2 sons have arrived in the wilderness.
My experience is of enormous relief. It's an extension of having just lowered my hands from the weight of war around me. I have shouldered this people alone. And now my Tzipporah, who is my bird, who is the woman who has allowed me to soar after I had left Egypt the first time, is now here with her father and our sons. And I'm just feeling in this moment as if I have had both my breath taken away and as if I'm beginning to feel the possibility of feeling light again.
It sounds like it's almost like a prayer you never prayed has been answered, that you would get succor and comfort and have some softness and some beauty and some intimacy in your life as a leader.
And not feeling that aloneness and that weight. Now I am back united with my immediate family. Different than being with Miriam and Aaron, who are my family too. But they were the family that was always somewhat at a distance, who I only really got to know going back into service. And it was always in the context of service. My wife, my father-in-law were my days as a shepherd, my days where I didn't carry a load.
Thank you. I want to be aware. Well, let me say first of all that this is the family that's different from the family of origin, so to speak. This is the adopted family that's chose you and have been chosen, and where you have your own seed planted and a future that is different. And I understand that aspect of your appreciation for what God has given you in this moment, a reward and a comfort. And I want to take you out of the role, but not the people who are listening, because even though you can't speak, I want to imagine that each of you participated in some way, thought about, well, wait a second, what would I have said as Moses? And I imagine one of you might have said or thought, yeah, no, I don't want my family here. I mean, can't have my family in the middle of my work. I'm in the middle of chaos out here with these people. I don't have any time for my family. I can imagine one of you thinking, well, wait a second. I don't have a lot of experience being a father. I mean, did the boys want to come? I mean, I understand Jethro. He probably wanted to get rid of his daughter and his grandchildren. Go with your father. I'm an old man. I can't take care of you any longer. But really, did you guys want to come? And I'm not going to play daddy with you. I mean, I never had a daddy to play with. And I can imagine another one. Well, what's Miriam and Aaron going to think? Or, well, what are the people going to think if I take time out of my work for them, my family? In other words, any given moment in the bibliodramatic role play, which is occupied by one person, people who aren't even on stage, so to speak, are thinking about this. And I invite you to notice, if you who are attending this, I just invite you to notice that you might have had a little response to that question that Elie entertained as Moses. What is it like when your family comes to your door, whom you haven't seen for so long? They've grown up, they've changed. How do you get to know them? How do I relate?
Now, I'm going to put you on the spot, Peter.
Oh, goody.
Because one of the things that also changed how I listen to others is how you listen to people in role play. As the director of a role play, what I saw you do is reframe what you heard. I gave you my Moses. Reframe what you heard.
Well, Elie, let me ask you first, did what I did with what you're calling a reframe, when you heard it in the role of Moses, did you feel heard? You understand my question, Elie?
Did I feel heard
You were in the role
when I was speaking?
Yes,
as Moses.
Yes, and I responded in a way that was reframing. Did you feel heard?
Yes.
Okay. So the most important thing about bibliodrama for the facilitator is responding to the role play in a way that validates what the person says, because they are skating on thin ice. They're just improvising. If they don't get some kind of support for that, they're going to feel very exposed and like, did I say the right thing? I did the best I could. So right away, I want to come in with something if they need it to say, I'm getting you. And here's what I'm getting. And sometimes I actually step into the role play and say, I'm Moses, and I've just come down from this weighty, awful ordeal of war. And here's my family. It's like, oh my God, thank you. I need to be comforted. I need to be warm. So I take the role, and in taking the role, the player gets to say, well, that's not quite right. Or they say, oh yeah, that's what I really meant. Thank you. And that is the listening aspect of the facilitator's task.
So I want to say to you, Peter, that as I became a rabbi, having been introduced and began to play with bibliodrama, both as a director for others and in many cases doing it as soliloquy, but in a director for others, I began to do what I saw you do, which is be fully present as a listener and to affirm what that person was doing, particularly in the beginning of the unfolding with many people present, many voices that would yet be heard. For the first few in particular, taking it in, experiencing it, and reframing it with more emotion and content. And as you just noted, allowing them to then react and correct me, to say, no, that's not exactly what I intended, or that's more than I meant, or exactly. And in most cases, it would be yes. And I would later use that technique in counseling. So I would have somebody tell me their problem, listen, present, and then say, now let me share with you what I have heard, and be them, adding but experiencing myself as them, and then saying, did I hear you correctly? Having added more emotion and even some content to what they had shared. So I share that because it was an unintended consequence of bibliodrama. My watching and learning from you to be present, to genuinely take in non-judgmentally, and then to replay it, but replay it as if I was that person re-experiencing it. And one last comment, and then that'll segue to Ari facilitating questions and comments. And that is what you just did at the end of the bibliodrama, knowing our time is limited, which is faceting. These are your words in your books, reframing and faceting. And that's to say, if you take any one moment, and there are many people listening as Moses, what I've always found illuminating is how many different Moseses there are, And the insight of Nachmanides, the 13th century, who said, each midrash, even when contradictory, is true.
Wow.
For he said, in any gap in the story, they're all, genuine ways of experiencing that moment
Oh
of
my
the imagination.
God. Stop. No. I want people to understand. I flew out here from New York at Elie's request to be. I ask you to imagine what it's like for our hero to find a friend. In every hero's journey, you leave behind the friends you had in childhood, because you cross over into the world that comes after you fall off the top of the ladder. When you fall into the wilderness, to the midbar. And in the midbar, in the wilderness, you go looking for friends, for like-minded, for kinship, for adopted friends. Elie is my best Jewish friend. And I use the word Jewish because I was an orphan in history, and I came to the door of the Jewish house, and I was welcomed, first by Father Sam, and then by men and women who thought I had something to offer. But from the outset, the quickest study, the most open and willing person, and the one who had the most to teach me as a study partner. And just now with Nachmanides, it happened again. That's why I'm here, because this dear man has invited me into his life, and I've been part of his life off and on without a break since then.
Thank you, my beloved friend.
You're welcome.
Ari, I'll allow you now to enable others to engage with their thoughts and questions for our beloved teacher.
Thank you. And it is a treat to have Peter out here. We've heard so much about him. So thank you, Peter, for making the trek. I know it was a long trip from New York and not without risk. So we wish you a safe stay and a safe return. And then I just want to make sure everyone knows. So we'll be doing, as a part of our pre-slichot evening at 8 p.m. California time. You're all invited to a Bibliodrama that Peter will be participating in, entitled, it's about the story of focusing on the time between the passing of Moses and the crossing of the Israelites into the Promised Land. I think it's entitled Release, Remembrance, and Faith, Resilience in a Time of Radical Uncertainty. So you'll get another chance to see Bibliodrama in action a few times this weekend, but certainly Saturday night. I sent you all the link. You just have to click the link at 8 o'clock and you'll be right into the room. You don't have to register for the program. So first question, Rochelle Ambersound, who is an artist, asks for Peter to talk about his art, because he also makes art. So can you tell us about your art and your art process and what you convey through your art?
What a kind question. Yeah, so I was introduced to a woman by the name of Jo Milgrom, Milgrom. Jo, J-O, was the wife of a very famous scholar. What was Rabbi Milgram's first name, Elie? You're muted, guy. Never mind. Anyway, Joe Milgram had created something called Handmade Midrash, or torn paper Midrash. And what you did was, and this was like child's play, but she did it with adults. We would study a story, let's say Jonah. We read the story, and she would say, choose a moment from this story, and here's a bunch of colored paper and some glue. Just tear the paper, don't cut, don't draw, just tear the paper and paste it onto this, and we'll show it. So I remember I did Jonah in the belly of the whale, and I did all sorts of stuff to just represent how chaotic it was in there. And, but I knew it was Jonah in the belly of the whale, and I held it up, and Joe Milgram said, because she knew about Bibliodrama, she said, so be Jonah in this moment. And I said, I'm Jonah, and I'm in the belly of the whale. And so that was how I started doing art. And I fell in love with torn paper Midrash. And I began a period of 3 years where I tried to do a torn paper Midrash for every parsha. And every now and then I would get an invitation, as one came from Rabbi Spitz, whose daughter was going to be bat mitzvahed. And he said, would you make a torn paper Midrash for my daughter's bat mitzvah? And when I came to California at this time and slept on the most comfortable bed I've ever slept in Elie's studio, there was my little torn paper Midrash that I made for Elie's daughter, Anna. So art has been a wonderful, wonderful, non-verbal way to do Midrash.
Thank you. There are people who are in the audience who met you and studied with you, and they were just saying hi. There's a Stuart Blickstein. There's a Rona Lesser. I don't know if you know the names, but they've met you. One met you 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Anyway,
thank you.
So my question is, another question is, so how does doing bibliodrama change you Jewishly?
Well, I mentioned that I got bar mitzvah. I mean, after 25 years of actually being recognized as a professional Jewish educator, I recognized that it wasn't so much that I wanted to have a bar mitzvah, that I owed it to the Jewish world to make formal entry and to say I acknowledge myself as wishing to be bar mitzvah. And actually I had two of them. I had one very eccentric bar mitzvah in a very Jewish renewal kind of bar mitzvah with drumming and dancing and all that stuff. Because I had friends who were Jewish. Amichai Lau Lavi, whose name may be familiar to some of you, was a storytelling, and he became a great friend. And then at my little conservative shul in Bayshore, I had a second bar mitzvah, way more. But I read Torah, I chanted the Haftarah. I felt like I knew my way around. I even could consult the sources in a way, and I continue to. I mean, this is an endless pleasure to be. What kind of a Jew am I? I'm a midrashic Jew. I'm a storytelling Jew, and there's been plenty of room for me at your table, which is our table.
Thank you. I'm looking at the list of questions in our limited time. Can you tell us what's the difference between when Jews do bibliodrama and non-Jews do bibliodrama?
Well, that's a great question. Fundamentally, there is no difference. That is to say, when you step into the shoes of, let's say, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and you're standing at the foot of the cross and watching your son get, going through that, you certainly can call up an anguish that has nothing to do with being a Christian, or of course Mary was Jewish, but that's irrelevant. There are differences, but I think it's way more important to underline the similarities. That is to say that the method of finding that place in the text that can be opened where the text is incomplete. Well, the New Testament, the Christian scripture is as gapped and as the Hebrew scripture. I mean, Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness. Oh, there's an interesting number for you, 40. So Jesus, tell us something about what was the wilderness experience like for you? I actually never asked that question. But you ask that question of a Christian, they don't have the right answer. Their teacher never asked them that question, and they never read a book that had the answer, and they make it up. And I affirm what they make up. And they are now doing Midrash.
You mentioned Amichai Lau Levi. Can you talk about your connection to storytelling and the?
Yes.
I don't know if he created it based on what you did.
No, he created storytelling, but there was a part of storytelling that was problematic to him. And they were, I can't remember what he calls them exactly, but they were the interludes where you have the prepared script. Storytelling is a scripted form of theater, but he had an improvisational pieces where the storyteller or the facilitator of the storytell would address the group, the audience. And it was always very awkward. They didn't have a way to do it. And Amichai heard about me. He was in New York, young. He called me into the city. I remember everything. And he showed me storytelling. And he said, I don't know what to do with these intervals. And I trained the storytelling people in using Bibliodrama in the intervals. And I'll tell you, one day I saw Amichai at a Cage conference do a whole Bibliodrama as his Devar Torah one Saturday morning. It was like watching Elie Spitz do it. It's like, holy smokes, he's really got it. And that's been an amazing experience for me to see other people in their own ways. I mean, Elie with the bibliodramatic soliloquy as a sermon. Wow, I would never do that. I came to do it, but it was always participatory. During COVID, you have to do that. So, there have been groundbreakers all over. I haven't heard of, I never certified anybody. They did that in Europe, but I just said, if it works for you, do it your way, figure it out.
Is there a particular heir to you're the creator of Bibliodrama? Who is the next person that we should know about right now who's doing stuff that you're looking at that we should, be aware of?
Well, I'm not in a position. I know so many people who are having to originate Judaism. Even in the conservative movement, there are so many demands placed on adaptation and change and evolution that are just so. I mean, I have the high. I mean, I am a conservative Jew. I'm a conservative Jew because of the veneration that the conservatives have for the text. Without that knowledge of the text and that commitment to the text, there can be no midrash. The rabbis talk about the Torah being written in black fire and white fire. Well, the black fire is the text. It's what we all can read. The white fire is all that space around and between the letters and above it. That's vast. It's endless. The parchment may end, but the white fire goes on forever. So the question could be, Ari, who's doing good white? Who's a white fireman today, or white firewoman? Who's doing white fire these days? Huh. You don't have time for me to tell you all the names I know, but Elie knows a bunch, and some of them are tuned into this right now. But the future of Judaism, in some ways, always is a dialogue between tradition and innovation. And you need both the black fire and the white fire. And what I celebrate about Rabbi Spitz is his embrace of the white fire in this particular way and in other ways as art, who also is able to quote, at the drop of a hat, Nachmanides. so that the elders are present, as they are in Talmud, where they are there on the edge of the page, where the past can be present. And yet the present is not co-opting the past, not slavishly bowing to the past, but drawing the past into our midst, into our own stories and our own lives. And this is magical work. This is innovation in which the past informs us as we reform from it and perform it for others, with others, in this improvisational space that is where we actually live existentially now.
Thank you. Well, it is exactly 1:30. So what a 1 hour. We had history, biography, acting, and contemporary analysis as to where we are in the world. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and the CSP crowd today. We look forward to spending time with you on Shabbat, those of you lucky enough to be here in Orange County at B'nai Israel. And then again online on Saturday night, 8 o'clock. We cannot change the time. People have asked, can we please change the time to because they have their own slichot services. We can't change the time. But I assume, Rabbi Spitz, that the program with Peter for Saturday night will be recorded and will be uploaded to both CSP and to CBI. So you can watch that live. And is there anything you want to share about this weekend before we break, Rabbi Spitz?
Well, may I just say that I would be happy to hear from anyone, and my email address is Asher, ASHER 65, the year I was bar mitzvahed, @gmail.com. Asher is my given Hebrew middle name, one of the sons of Yisrael.
Thank you. Rabbi Spitz, you want to wrap it up?
I just have a full heart when I'm in your presence, Peter, because I am fulfilled by your presence. I want to thank you, Ari, for enabling a broader sharing, and blessings to all of Shabbat Shalom and Shana Tova.
Thank you. So if you want to join us on Saturday night, you can look, you should have received emails from me, or you can, I'll send another email to everybody who participated with the link for Saturday night. You can go to www.cbi18.org as well, get information from there. Looking forward to a nice Shabbat, having Peter here. Keep safe, everybody. See you this weekend. See you on Sunday with David Broza. Take care. Be safe, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Peter.